Welcome. Who went to the keynote? Lots of you. This is a bit of a strange session to have after the keynote, I think. You usually see things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, and there's probably lasers in there somewhere, and now it's like, let's design some printer-friendly reports. Who's used reporting services before? OK. Very few people are lost. Most of you are here because you're in the right room. This is a topic of interest. Yeah, it is sort of one of those topics that if you're not tasked as part of your job, as part of your work, with creating these very document-centric or printer-friendly reports, then maybe this isn't the most interesting topic. But if you are, then you really care deeply about it, and you really, really want to hone your skills in being able to create these sorts of reports. So that's what we're going to talk about today. My name is Ricardo Muti. I'm a group program manager at Microsoft for SQL Server Reporting Services. And as of recently, it's, I guess, cousin product, Power BI Report Server. But today we're going to be talking about functionality that's been available in SQL Server Reporting Services, or SSRS, for many years. Of course, using the latest version of it, though. And we're going to be talking about, because now the platform that we're building on supports a number of different types of reports for different use cases. We have reports that are more designed for document generation and printing, and then we have reports that are more designed for consumption on a mobile device. They have more of a responsive layout. With Power BI Report Server, we support very interactive, exploratory Power BI reports as well. I have a session later today on all about Power BI Report Server and interactive Power BI reports that are meant to be more analytical and exploratory, but that's not the topic of this session. This session, we're going to be focusing on traditional document-centric paginated reports. They're called paginated reports because whereas other reports may have some sort of concept of a page or a slide, these are paginated in the sense that if you have a table like this one, for example, or you have a list, the more data that comes in, it's not just a fixed page. That data will eventually flow onto the next page and onto the next one. So the number of pages you get are dynamic. The more data you have coming back, the more pages you may get. So it's a traditional report in that sense. So I mentioned in the abstract for this session that it's neither a Reporting Services 101 nor a Reporting Services PhD course. So if you have never used reporting services before, never built a report before, even a basic one, then you probably don't have enough context to get the most out of this session. On the other hand, if you are a reporting services guru, then you might not learn anything today that you didn't already know. If you are not calling out anybody in particular, but an MVP who has literally written the book on reporting services, then I'd be puzzled why you're here, but apparently the answer is for moral support, so that's cool, that's fine. But actually, on that note, I mean, yeah, actually, I think I wrote it in the foreword for your book that when I joined Microsoft, I had used reporting services. I was probably in the target audience for this session at the time. I knew a little bit about it. But I didn't have a computer on my first day of work. It was back-ordered. And it took me I think a week before I got a computer. I'm like, what am I supposed to do?
You did tell the story in the forward.
Yeah, I'm like, what am I supposed to do at Microsoft in my empty office with no computer for a week? And you can only chit-chat and get to know people for so long before you've met everybody. Now what do I do? And so my boss, who has what's now my position, so things kind of have a weird way of coming full circle, said, here you go, and slapped this giant book on my desk. And it was Reporting Services Recipes. And it was sort of like written in the style of a recipe book that if you need to do this sort of pattern in your report, here's how you do it. And if you need to do this other common pattern, here's how you do it. And Paul Turley, who's sitting in the front row, was a co-author along with a reporting services engineer on that book. And so I learned reporting services in large part from that book, from doing nothing but reading it for a week. So the more up-to-date version of it is out, so I encourage you to take a look at that. Some things that we'll touch on today. Number one, the Tablix control. How do you use a Tablix control to organize data as sort of a structuring component of your report, and then use all sorts of other things in the Tablix control? And more than that, really giving you a very, very sound, fundamental understanding of the Tablix control and all of the features and how it works. Because this is one of those things that if you've ever built a reporting services report before, then you've used this control, but not everybody necessarily really understands all of the concepts within the Tablix control and all of the power that it has, and doesn't always understand everything that's going on when you're using it. So I want to give you a deeper knowledge of how that control works. The second thing that I want to do is focus on not just how do you use this control, but how do you build better reports, more effective reports, where instead of having to go and dig through the information and read it, that the insights just sort of pop off the page at you. So while the operative word for this sort of report is read, you read a report. That said, the less reading you have to do to get to the interesting pieces of data, and the more they just pop out the screen at you, the better. And finally, a lot of people have challenges when they're designing a report specifically for output to PDF and print, which is increasingly what people use reporting services for. They get things not fitting on the page properly, things sort of bleeding onto the page both horizontally and vertically. I want to give you some tips in the course of this demo for showing you how to optimize your reports for output to PDF and print. So it's going to be a pretty demo-heavy session. I do need to ask you to hold questions till the end if we even have time for questions, just because this, in the past, I've done a session like this, and it's normally 75 minutes, and even that feels cramped. So it is a tough session to stop for questions, but I will be available throughout the conference for other questions. Just a quick background on me. I guess I touched on it before, which is I've been at Microsoft for about 7 years now. I started on the reporting services team. And in some shape or form, I've been on the BI team at Microsoft for the entire time that I've been here. So I started on reporting services. I built a V1 product, or was one of the people working on a V1 product called Power View that evolved into Power BI, both Power BI Desktop and Power BI in the cloud service, and worked on Power BI for a while. And then about 2 years ago, I came kind of full circle to focus on what should we do with reporting services? How should we update it? And so that led to a very well-received release in SQL Server 2016. And then I've sort of come back to combining these two things again to ship Power BI Report Server, which is generally available as of today. And I mentioned I have a session on that later today. Here are some ways that you can get in touch with me: Twitter, LinkedIn, and I blog on the Reporting Services team blog. You'll all get these slides, by the way, so you'll have those links. So let's start with the Tablix control. What is a Tablix? A Tablix, at its most basic, is just a table. So here's an example of a table. And the data, in this case, in this example, comes from the United States Department of Agriculture. It is just some data on different states and a particular crop that they produce, and a whole bunch of metrics about how much of that crop they planted and how much they harvested and how good the yield was that season and so on. So this is a table. You have rows and columns. There are two different types of rows. You've got a static row. This is not data bound. It's just a header row, and it's going to say those values no matter what data comes back. And then you've got a row group, also known as a dynamic row. So this row actually has a template that you design one particular row and how it looks, and any expressions or formulas or formatting you have in there. That's your template row. But then as more and more data comes back, you're going to get several instances of that template row at runtime. Now, a table doesn't have to be a details table. It doesn't have to show one row for every row in your data. It can do grouping. So here, your data might look something like this. You might have a row for every state and a row for every year. And so you might have 10 rows for every state. But if you want to aggregate that and you don't care about per year, then your table can group on one of these fields and group multiple rows into one. Where a Tablix becomes more than a table is that a table is also a matrix. This is a matrix. It's got rows and columns. So you've got this static column on the left that's just got a header called state. But then you've got this column group, or a dynamic column, where it's bound to the year. And the more years that come back in your data set, you'll get one instance of that column for every year that comes back. So this is a matrix, also known as a crosstab sometimes. And if you've used old versions of reporting services before 2008, they had two different controls, actually 3 different controls, for table, matrix, and list. We'll get to list a little bit later, but it had 2 different controls for table and matrix, which meant that if you started with a table, you could not easily change it to a matrix later. So part of the benefit of the Tablix control that we introduced a few years ago was that you can start with a table, and then change it into a matrix. Or you could start with the matrix and decide, I don't want these columns per year anymore, and just change it to a table. So it's the same control, and they're just two different templates, and they're fluid. You can move from one to the other. But that's not the only benefit. If that was the only benefit, that'd be a nice convenience feature. But the really powerful thing about a Tablix, beyond what many other BI tools have as either a table or a matrix control, is that it doesn't have to be either a pure table or a pure matrix. It can be a hybrid of the two. So for example, here I have the column group, the dynamic column from the matrix, but I can also have as a peer of that static columns like a table. So I can show some top-level metrics and then go into something dynamic, like a column per year, a column per department, a column per geography, or whatever it is that you want. So with that, let's see an example of that. We'll just do a quick demo. So here I am in Report Builder. I did have to adjust my resolution so the projector would cooperate. So normally I have a little bit more screen real estate, but we'll do what we can. And hopefully it's not too blurry as well. But what I'm going to do, normally I would use the table wizard or the matrix wizard to insert a table, and it makes it a lot easier to get started. But because this is a little bit more of an advanced session, and I want to give you this really sound knowledge of how the table control works, I'm going to do everything manually from scratch. So I'm going to insert a table here. It's right there on my canvas. And now I have a different data set in here, just to mix things up. So if I double-click on this data set, I grab some data on the housing market, because I've recently bought a house, and in the course of shopping for a house, especially in the Seattle market, really got fascinated by all of the data behind the housing market. So you look at things like in which markets do houses sell the quickest? How many days are they on the market on average? In which markets do houses sell over asking price, and how much over asking price? Are things heating up in a market or cooling down in a market? So there's all this cool data behind it. And grab data from a number of different places. Redfin has data they offer. Zillow has an API you can use. Local MLS, multiple listing services, they offer data. So I got a bunch of this data and incorporated it here into a database. And if I run the query designer, it's just a SQL query that I ran against my database. I'll run this. It's going to prompt me for some parameters. Again, my resolution's messing with me a little bit here. But let's just put in, I'm going to get the last 12 months of data. So May 31st, 2016. And my data ends at the end of April, so that's where I'll stop. So April 30th, 2017. I'll run that. And you can see what the data looks like. Similar to the other example, I've got one row for every region, in this case a city. But I've also got one row for every month in the period that I've chosen. So I've got 12 rows for each city because I've got one for each month. So there's my data. I'll just get out of here. And so here are all the fields that came back. I've got some really interesting fields like the city, the time period, and then I've got how many homes were sold, how many days on the market was it on the market as a median, price per square foot, the list price, the sale price, all these other things. So I'm going to drag in by city, and then the median sale price. Just drag it in just like that. I'm going to change my font while I'm in here. Make it Sego UI. And I'll run this. So that, when people are getting started using reporting services, is not what they intuitively expect, because I put city and I put a metric in one row, and I thought I was going to get one row for every city. But if you think about the structure of the data, that makes sense. I haven't grouped by anything yet. So if I come back here, I can see that right here, you'll see that it says details. So the one group that I have on my rows is just a details group. That means I'm going to see one row for every row of data in the data set. Another clue that you're in details mode is this little hamburger-looking icon here, which tells you that you're in a details group. So what I'm going to do is I want to group by something. So I'm going to take city, and I'll just, instead of dragging that into the table, I'll drag it into row groups. So now we're grouped by city. And I don't need this column anymore, so I'll delete that. And I'll make this a little bit wider. Now let's run it. OK, so I sort of got one row per city, but I still have this details group, and that's why I'm still getting one child row per month. So let's delete that details group. And whenever I delete something, it gives me a choice. It says, do you want to delete the group and the related rows and columns? So in this case, it's a row group, so it's going to delete the row that it's in. Or just delete the group, but leave the table structure the same. Don't delete the row or column. Well, in this case, this is my only row with data. So if I do what the default says, I'm going to go and delete this details group. Yep, you can delete the related row. Well, that was my only row. So there are examples of when you want to do that and when you don't want to do that. In this case, I do not want to do that. So I will delete the group. And you'll see the purpose of this option here and why it's handy. So I'll just say, no, just delete the group only, leave the row intact. You'll notice no change in the table. But down in the row groups, I'm only grouping by city now. OK? So now, when I run this, OK, now I get one row per city. Now, can anybody tell me, for 1 million points, what is wrong with these values? Who said that it's just the first one? You guys. OK. You're way too advanced for this session, I guess. That's really good, man. It just shows the depth of I always find this, and I always found it as a newbie to reporting services, kind of an obscure thing, kind of an counterintuitive thing. But the fact that there's always somebody in the room who knows that tells you just how much people use reporting services and learn these nuances. So yes, so remember that I have 12 rows per city, one for each month. And here, those 12 rows are being grouped into one row. So which median sale price is it taking for which month? And so the default behavior of reporting services is it won't try and guess, do you want to sum it? Do you want to average it? Do you want to take the median? It will just take the first one that appears in the data. So that's not what I want. I want the median sale price of, I could take the average over the period, over the 12 months. But what I actually want to do is I want to show the most up-to-date value. So I want to show the median sale price as of the last month. So it's the last month of the data, in the data, not the first month. So I'm going to right-click on this and say Summarize By. And instead of first, I will choose last. And there's many other aggregates that you can choose. It's more common to choose something like sum or average. But in this case, I want the most recent data point, so I want last. And while I'm at it, let's just format this. I'm going to format this as a currency with 0 decimal places. Maybe make this header bold. I don't need this column anymore. And let's run that. There you go. OK, so I've got every city, and I've got the most up-to-date, the median sale price as of the last month that's passed. And we could already start to see some things that make sense. San Francisco is way up there at almost $1.5 million, the median price of a home in San Francisco. Apparently, in Detroit, you can buy a home for less than the price of a mid-sized car, which is pretty awesome. So yeah, quite a disparity. So now, if I want to add some other stuff here, really look at the grouping capabilities of a Tablix, let's add back the year. So if I want to group by year, let's go and grab the period end, which in my case means sorry, not the year, the month. Oops. Make this a little bit bigger. I'm going to take year, or period end, and drag it into row groups, just between city and just underneath city, so that I have it as a child group. Now, another thing that I want to point out, just a piece of knowledge when you're using the Tablix control, is you'll see these brackets, this orange bracket and this yellow bracket. So these mean something. The orange bracket means, or any of these brackets means that the cell that you've selected is grouped by those things that are bracketed. So for example, let me grab a different cell. Let me grab this one here. And as I zoom in, you'll see, so I have selected this cell in the body of the Tablix. And it's saying that it's grouped by city and by period. The one that is orange is the innermost scope at which it's grouped. So that's just something to keep in mind. Helps you understand what sort of grouping scope of the data you are in the Tablix. Now that I've done that, let's add some subtotals. So here, I will right-click under period, and I will say insert or add total after. I can make that bold. And under city here, I'll also say add total after, and make that bold. And here, I just want to format this as because it's a date. You'll see when I run it that it's showing up as this really long date. I just want to see the month and the year, because it's just a monthly thing. So I'm just going to say, format this as a date, and then actually open this up. And I can choose a custom format, and I'm going to say MMM for a 3-letter date and 4 Ys for the year. And now when I run this, there we go, that looks a lot better. So if you can see that, you've got city, the month, and then the sale price, and then you see my subtotal there. So again, those brackets that I mentioned, if you look in here, let's choose this cell. You'll see that I'm grouped in this body cell by city and by period. But if I choose something else, like I choose this subtotal, then it changes. You'll see that I'm only grouped by city. City is the innermost one where I'm grouped. So this helps you understand when you have a formula in here and you're getting a different value from what you expect, check the scope at which you're grouped. And maybe it's not grouped by what you think it's grouped by. Now, I claimed that it was easy to take a table and transform it into a matrix. So what if I wanted year on columns? Let's actually see what that would look like if I wanted to morph this into a matrix. I'm going to get rid of my subtotals. I don't need that. So I'll delete those rows. And now I'm going to delete this column. And this time, I do want to delete the year or the month. I keep calling it year. I want to delete the month group, and I also want to delete this column because I'm going to have it as dynamic columns. So delete that, and then I'm going to take the period end, and instead of dragging it into row groups, I'm going to drag it into column groups. And so now here, let me again just format this the way I want. OK? And then normally in a matrix, there's a convention from a design perspective that if you have multiple measures that you're showing in your matrix, you list the name of the measure so you know which one is which. But if you only have one measure, your crosstab is only about one thing, like median price, then you don't actually need to say the name of the measure. You might say it elsewhere in a title or something above it to just use less space in your matrix. So I'm actually going to delete this median sale price thing, copy or cut and paste the city up here. And that way I can just save rows in my matrix. So I'll delete this row. And now I'll have city on the rows, months on the columns, and I should have the median sale price in between. There you go. There's a matrix. So I just transformed a table into a matrix. So now let's go make one of those hybrid table matrix things that I talked about. So here, I can take my dynamic column group, and I want to put a static column beside it and show just the total number of houses sold in this time period. So I'm going to right-click, say Insert Column, and it says, do I want it to the left or the right, which is pretty straightforward. But then it gives me this other option. Do I want inside group or outside group? So the group that I clicked on was grouping by month. So this other column do I want? Do I want it to be grouped by month, or do I want to be outside of that scope, not grouped by month? Well, I said I wanted the total number of houses sold in the entire year-long period, so I don't want it to be inside this group. I want it to be outside. So I'm going to right-click this, say Insert Column outside of the group to the left. And then you'll see, again, these handy brackets here. I mean, that orange bracket shows up when I'm within that group scope. But when I'm outside of the group, you will see that that thing turns gray and is no longer orange. So I'm not grouped by year. This is what I mean about you can sort of troubleshoot where you are in the data grouping scope. Now in here, I'm going to take homes sold and put that in here. And it automatically sums it for me in this case, which is nice. I'm just going to format this as a number with 0 decimal places. And the next thing I want to add here, so I'm going to say Insert Column to the right, another column, another metric, is I want to add the median number of days on the market. I want to see which markets are the hot markets and which markets are the cool markets. Or another way of saying that is, which are the buyer's markets and which are the seller's markets. So I'll pump that in here. And then in this case, I don't want the sum of the number of days on market. I'm going to get all the houses, all the days they've been on the market, and sum that all up into some giant number. I want the average number of days on the market for a home. So I'm going to summarize by average. And we'll call this median days on market. OK. Run that. So you can see, let's format that a little bit better. Let's format that as a number. Run that. There you go. So already you can sort of see that I've got this hybrid table matrix thing going. I've got 2 static columns. They don't repeat depending on the data. And then I have these other columns that repeat for each month. Let's add a couple more here. I'm going to make this smaller. And I want to add something to the right here. Again, outside the group to the right. One of the things I lose when I group by the month is just I want to see something like a grand total sort of thing. I want to see, or a subtotal. I want to see the current median price of a home without all this detail of grouping it by month. So here what I'm going to do is just take the median list price, median sale price, drag it over here. And instead of summing this, again, summarize by the last value. And the last piece of data that I'm interested in, just format this as a number. Last piece of data that I'm interested in, inserting another column here, is the sale price to list price ratio. So did it sell for 98% of asking price, 104% of asking price? I have that here, median, where is that? So it's average sale to list ratio. I'm going to drag that in here. And this one, I'm going to choose the last value as well, summarized by the last month. And then I'm going to format this one as a percentage. Percentage, OK. Make this a little bit wider to accommodate the headers. And let's run this. OK, so there's all my per months. And then at the end, I've got the median sale price and the average sale to list price. So you can see some are selling for under asking. In Detroit, apparently, they don't ask any money when you buy a house. I don't know, probably something wrong with the data, I'm guessing. But in some markets, you can see that things sell above asking. OK. So that is a pretty powerful table in terms of what we've done with the data grouping, but it's also pretty bland in terms of I didn't use any color or graphics or anything like that. So let's switch back to slides and transition to that topic. So hopefully you have, did that help you get a better understanding of how the Tablix works? Yep. Hopefully useful as you're building tables going forward. It is a little bit of an abridged version of that demo. It's a topic that gets even more complex than that. So it's deceptively complex and powerful, that control. But now let's look at, great, I've created a table like this. I'm shifting back to my crop harvesting example. But you've got this plain table. It's got lots of information in it. But nothing really kind of leaps off the screen at you, and you got to go digging to see if there's anything interesting here. How can we make this better? Well, one of the things we can do is we can just sort of cut the fluff from this. By default, when you insert a table in many tools, you'll tend to get a lot of grid lines, and some of those might not be necessary for readability. So I can cut this down. Some people like to do alternating row colors to just help you read. Some people like to do thin grid lines across. Some people prefer it with no lines. But I think cutting down on the wireframe sort of box look definitely gives your report a cleaner look. So this is one thing that you can do. And some tips to keep in mind here would be just cut all the fluff, cut all the extraneous borders that you don't really need. Use a readable font. And a readable font would be like a sans serif font. Don't use a serif font like Times New Roman or anything like that. Also, legend says that if you use Comic Sans in your report, then somewhere a kitten dies, so don't do that. I talked about minimal borders. That means different things to different people, but some people would find this too minimal and hard to read. Alternating row colors or thin grid lines, as I mentioned, are other couple options you can play with. And one of the things that I think works well, and again, we're getting into sort of subjective design here, but I think one of the principles that I try and follow is have the data values be emphasized and the metadata and the labels be de-emphasized or dimmed a little bit. So for the column headers, in many tools, what they'll actually do is the opposite. They'll like bold the headers, and then your data is more subtle. I actually prefer to do the opposite. Dim the headers, dim the metadata, and have your data be black instead of gray, and have your attention focus on the actual data values.
What can I kill with a 3D pie chart?
What can you kill with a 3D pie chart? All the endangered species of the world, yeah. The giraffe, I forget the giraffe's name. Anyway, yeah, don't do that. Not a fan of 3D charts. So, and then finally, I used an accent color here. So my guidance there would be use accent colors sparingly. A lot of reports use a lot of extraneous colors that don't actually mean anything. And the thinking is they make your report look more interesting. But in actual fact, I'm searching, like, does this color mean anything? Or there's just a lot of colors going on. If I'm going to reserve the use of color to mean something, like very often you'll use red, yellow, green to mean good, neutral, or bad, then I don't want other things competing for that attention. But it is nice to have a little bit of a pop of color. So one thing you can do is just choose one accent color for your report, use it throughout. In this case, I've used blue. In my demo, I'll use purple. I wouldn't choose red or green or anything that tends to have a strong meaning in people's mind like that. And then you can use it very sparingly like this one thin border I have along the top. The other thing we can do is we can start introducing graphics and colors into the table and into the data itself where it does have meaning. So for example, this harvested percent. Like we have to start thinking about why are we even looking at this data? What are we going to do with this data? Why do we care? So for harvested, it's the percentage of the amount planted that was successfully harvested. So this is a KPI sort of thing. Generally, I would think that if I'm in this agriculture business, I want that to be as close to 100% as possible. Anything less than that is waste. So I want to look for where I have really good, close to 100% harvested percentage, or even more importantly, where it's really low and really far from 100%, and where I have a lot of waste. So one way to show something like that, if it qualifies as a business rule, would be as a KPI. And there I use an indicator, a status indicator that's available inside of reporting services. And I can have a rule like if it's over 95%, make it green. If it's under 90%, make it red. And so I can do something like that. And right there, I don't have to scan the table. I don't have to read it. I can just look at, OK, Florida and Michigan, that's where I should focus my attention. That's a problem. So visualizing rules is something to start to consider when you want to emphasize the data in your report. Using simple icons, there's a whole bunch of stuff in the KPI gallery, all sorts of fancy shapes. I tend to stick to the simple ones. The only counterpoint to that would be that if you are thinking about how to make your report accessible to people who, for example, a large proportion of the population is colorblind or specifically has red-green color blindness where they can't really tell the difference between these shades, then you can't use just color and certainly not red, amber, green colors to distinguish between these things. You have to use something else. So you could consider using a shape. You could consider just the fact that they can just read the actual values, of course. But it's something to be cognizant of that color alone would be a problem for some people. But depending on how you design your report, if there's a mitigation to that, then avoiding all sorts of fancy shapes, better to use just simple ones. Another thing you can do if you don't want sort of discrete colors like it's either red or it's green, it's either good or it's bad, but it's more you just want to get a sense of the spectrum, which is the worst, which is the best, which is the ones that are sort of in between. You can show a color scale like this, a gradient color scale. Now this isn't built into reporting services, but thankfully, and this is an example of the power you have with reporting services, is that you can write custom code. So I can write any sort of formula I want in my expression. Anything I can do in VB.NET, I can do here. And custom code, anything I can do in VB.NET or in C# or any other .NET language, I can write as much code as I want, and I can reference it in my report. So for example, in some reports, I've built this function color scale red, yellow, green, and other variants of color scales. And I can just call it as a function from all of my expressions, and it will calculate a color interpolated from the data value. So there's a sample. I can point you to a blog post of how to do that. But just know that even when you hit the wall of what you can do with the built-in visuals and built-in properties, you can write custom code to do things like this. So consider color scales. One thing that a lot of people don't necessarily think of intuitively, but that tends to work well, as in this example, would be you don't necessarily need to color a large area of your visualization. You can take a small square like that and color it, and it can have the desired effect without introducing too much noise to your visual. Whereas what a lot of people do is they'll do this, and you can do that, but I think it shows how it adds a lot of noise to your table, and the other way, you can just cut down on that while still having the exact same effect. The exception to that rule would be when you're going to do it over a two-dimensional area. So for example, over the years, if I wanted to do this, then you have a sort of heat map sort of thing. You wouldn't then want a million squares showing up in this table. So that's where, if you're actually going for a heat map, coloring the entire cell so that everything is adjacent does make sense. And finally, another option would be to color the text itself. You can do that. If you're using a color scale like this, you start to get into the middle, like yellows and things like that, and then readability can be an issue. So I generally avoid this if I'm doing a color scale. But it can be useful if you just want to highlight more discrete values. Like anything below 80% I want to be in red and just grab my attention, and everything else I'll just leave it black. So that's a possibility as well. just showing you kind of the spectrum of options and some of the pros and cons. So some guidance here would be if you're going to use a fill, like a background color, to do conditional coloring, then you want to choose a lighter color so that your darker text stands out on top of it and has enough contrast. Whereas if you're coloring lines or text, you want those colors to be darker so that they have contrast over a lighter background. Now, we have this data in this matrix showing for each state the production over years. And again, there's just a lot of numbers there. What am I supposed to do with that? Am I really looking at the precise value, like exactly how many hectares was harvested in 1962? Maybe, but maybe that data can be stuffed into an appendix or something somewhere. What I'm probably looking for, and what's probably interesting in this sort of data set, is the trend over time. Is California producing more or less over time? Is Maine producing more or less over time? What's the rate of growth or rate of decline? So a better way to show that in much less screen real estate and with the answers much more quickly popping out at you would be with a spark line. So there is a spark line. And you don't have to lose the details. If you're viewing this interactively on a screen, you can do a toggle, expand, collapse that would still show the matrix columns and dynamically show and hide them. Or as I said, you can hyperlink to an appendix where you have those matrix tables, sort of as like reference tables, or just put them later in your report or not put them at all. So those are some options. I mentioned before, if you do go this route, you kind of lose that, what was that subtotal? What is the total amount produced for California? You can still go add that as a static column outside of your group by time. So whenever you have a trend over time, think about a spark line as an alternative to just showing this large matrix over time. Think about simple colors. So here again, I'm not trying to denote whether anything is good or bad or anything. So I chose to use gray and not introduce yet another color so it doesn't detract attention from me. Think about still having the details available, either expandable or relegated to an appendix. And whenever you have a spark line or data bar or something like that, a chart effectively embedded in a table, you have this option and this decision to make of do you want to align the axes across the table or not. So in this case, the horizontal axis is the time axis. I wouldn't want to be showing different states over different periods of time. So if the data is not all rectangular, the data is maybe ragged and some months are missing, you want to enable that option, and it is enabled for you by default, so that the axes are aligned. Every one is showing the same 12-month period. The vertical axis in this example is not aligned, because if I did align it, everything has the same maximum value on the vertical axis. Then states that produce way more, like California and Arizona, they would have useful trend spark lines, but all the other ones, by comparison, relatively speaking, they would be like flat lines along the bottom. And it would help me get a sense of the overall scale, but it wouldn't help me see the shape of the growth. So generally, you don't want to align the vertical axis when there's huge disparity in the values between these rows. Here I introduce another column for the yield. And again, instead of just introducing a column full of numbers, you can introduce a data bar. And the data bar will quickly let me see the relative values of things by just looking at and comparing lengths rather than having to go and actually think about the numbers. In this example, I've also colored them as well, which some people might find kind of redundant, but it's just showing a couple of different examples. I can use the color to denote like the health as well, or I can just use the data bar all the same color. But when you do use color, I think the point is sort of trying to think about whether the color means anything. In this case, you definitely want to align the axis. There's only one axis, and it's just showing the total value. If you didn't, all the data bars would be roughly the same length, and they wouldn't really mean anything. So generally, with a data bar, the answer is easy. You align the axis. And finally, I have this percentage of total column. And this is a twist on a spark line. Instead of introducing a spark line, I introduced a spark pie, if that's a word, if you want to think about that. And this is where people will talk about pie charts being evil and never use pie charts. And I don't know. Pie charts are definitely misused a lot. They're maybe the most misused data visualization. But I think there are cases where a pie chart can actually be a really compact way of representing something in a way that makes sense. So a pie chart is good, the guidance goes from a data visualization perspective, for showing the part-to-whole relationship. How much does something contribute to the whole? It's not good at comparing angles among many different things, but this is just comparing two things, California versus the entire United States, or all of the states in this chart. So it's showing graphically that it is more than half, that it's 61%. And so just looking at this, I didn't even read these numbers. I can just see, OK, Arizona and California, that's the majority, and everything else is negligible. Right? So I can see the part-to-whole contribution here. So that's something to consider as a valid use of a pie chart. So Spark pies, I don't know if that's a word. If not, I'm coining it. Think about simple colors. Again, the color doesn't mean anything in this case. I didn't do any conditional coloring or anything, so I tended to make it gray. I prefer my pie charts to start at 12 o'clock. In some tools, they start at 12. In some tools, they start at 3 o'clock. From a mathematical perspective, 3 o'clock is more correct. But from a data viz perspective, it's just kind of weird. So I prefer to adjust it to start at 12. And so what we ended up with was just some ideas. So this is a really, really simple table. Nothing jumps out at me. And through a bunch of graphical and color transformations, we got something like this. Now, this might look a little bit busy. You don't have to use all of these tips in every single table that you create. But I think it's meant to give you some ideas of how you can make the insights pop off the screen. In the other example, I had to read the whole thing to figure out what was going on. I look at this and I say, OK, Florida's harvested percentage is really low. That needs attention. California, by far, produces the most out of the United States, along with Arizona. California is producing more over time, whereas Connecticut is producing less over time. All of those just jumped out at me in about 5 seconds. So make your tables pop is the point. So with that, let me switch back to my demo, and we'll look at some of these examples in the context of my other demo. If my computer will cooperate. There we go. OK. So first of all, let's take our median days on the market. And I want to show this as a data bar. So what I'm going to do is insert a column to the right. And here I'm going to take days on the market. I'm going to right-click in the cell of the table, say Insert, Data Bar. I'll choose a data bar. Here's my data bar. I'll click on that. And then for the value for the data bar, I will just pick the median days on the market. And again, I don't want the sum. I want the average. So I'm going to click Average. And then I'll run that. One last thing that I tend to do is I tend to remove the border. It tends to like to put borders on everything. So I'm just going to remove the border here. Say border none, or border style none. And then we'll run this. And now we've got median days on the market as a data bar. So let's go back and do some conditional coloring. So first of all, I'm going to merge these two cells. And here, I'm going to take my data bar, and I'm going to right-click on the series properties. And let's go to the fill for the data bar. And I want the fill to be not a static color, but an expression. So let me grab this function thing here. And this just shows sort of the power of reporting services, is that everywhere this is a really magic button. Every time you see this button, that means that something can be dynamic based on data. And you'd be surprised what can be dynamic. Like if I want something to be italic or not, that can be dynamic. If I want border width to be 1 point or 2 points, that can be dynamic. So I can draw thicker borders over things that are more interesting. So really powerful. Look for that button everywhere, and that's where you can do any sort of conditional formatting, conditional visibility. So I have, just in the interest of time, my expressions pre-written out. So for days on the market, I am going to take this expression that I wrote. And plop it in here. And all it's saying is if the average days on the market is within 3 weeks, so if the home on average sells within 3 weeks, then give it this color, which is sort of a red color, I believe, to demonstrate that it's a hot market. Otherwise, just show it in gray. So I'm not doing this color scale thing where I color everything. I'm only coloring the ones that I'm really interested in, which are the really hot markets. I'll click OK. And run that. And now you can see that the hot markets, this is what I mean about it just leaping off the screen at you. The hot markets are Boston, Denver, San Francisco, and here in Seattle. Here in Seattle, right now, if you put a home on the market, it sells in 9 days. which is pretty crazy. Now, a lot of people don't like these really thick data bars. They wonder, how can I make a data bar that's thinner than the row that it's in? Because what will happen is when you insert a data bar, by default, it will just fill up the size of the cell. So here's the secret to how you can do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this data bar, paste it out here, and then in here, in the cell, rather than putting the data bar directly, I'm going to insert a rectangle. Anytime you want to create like a mini nested canvas inside of a table cell, you put a rectangle in it. Now that thing, in turn, can have whatever you want inside of it, even multiple things inside of it, sized however you want. They don't have to fill up the whole cell. So I'm going to take this, and I'm going to make this a lot smaller, and then put this back. Actually, I'll just cut and paste it inside of my rectangle, and there you go. It's smaller. I can run this. And now you've got a thinner data bar, thinner than the cell. So that may seem like a really kind of obscure trick, but again, the point is, anytime you want anything nested within a cell and not filling up the whole cell, a rectangle is your friend. So just in the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead. I'm going to close this off. And I'm going to skip ahead here to a report that I pre-created. And here's just an example of the additional things that I did with the table, spruced it up kind of a little bit. And if I run this, there's my nice looking table. I formatted a few other things using the same sort of tricks. Now what I want to do is I actually want to add a list. And a list, what I want to do is for each city, I want to have like a page for each city or two showing more details about that city. So I'm going to insert a list, which is just a Tablix, except it just has one cell. And this list has a rectangle in it. So this is an example of what I was just talking about. I'm going to take this. I'm going to group it by city. Oops. Group this by city. Delete that column. OK, so now I'm going to have one of these rectangles repeated for every city. And so what I can start doing is I can take something like a text box like this, paste it in here, and let's put the name of the city. City. And then let's put a chart in here. So I'm going to get a repeating chart. Insert a chart, just like this. And let's choose a line chart. I'm going to show for each city the median sale price over time. Excuse my screen resolution here. So the category axis, the x-axis, is going to be time. So I'm going to grab the period end. And the values is going to be the median sale price. And that will be, yep, sum is fine. And then I'm just going to grab this. I prefer to make the charts a little bit nicer looking, to take the border width, which is the width of the line, and just make it a little bit bigger if I don't need that much precision. So I'm going to bump this up to 3 points. You can see it looks a little bit more modern, a little bit nicer. And so I'm not going to spend too much time polishing this, just in the interest of time. But I'm going to run this, and you'll see what you get. You get Atlanta, a chart for Atlanta. You get Baltimore, you get Boston, and so on. Okay. So this is a really cool way. If you think about it, this is the difference between an interactive slice and dice sort of report versus something that's going to be spit out to a PDF. If I design something for slicing and dicing, in Excel or something like that, and then I go print it, I'm going to get it in whatever state it's filtered in. But if I'm designing something from the outset for document generation, then I'm going to need all of those states. If I want to see all of them, I can't interact with the PDF, to be repeated one after the other. So this allows me to do exactly that. So I'm going to skip ahead, where I've done quite a bit more work here. Just to show you a few of the things that I've done. So here what I did was I inserted a page header. You just go insert header and insert a page header. I put some expressions in here to just show a restatement of the filtering that was done. So there are parameters in the report on start date, end date. I just repeated them here. Here's the same table that you saw. And in here, I've got my list. That's the city name. I put a few metrics in here just in a nested table inside of that rectangle. And then here what I've done is insert a gauge. And if I look at my gauge, and I right-click on the gauge, oops, there we go. And I go to the properties for the gauge. Even something like the fill color for a gauge can be an expression. So here I have an expression that says if in that market, homes tend to sell for less than 3 weeks, make it red, otherwise make it yellow, and if it takes over 2 months to sell a house, then make it blue. It's a cool market or a buyer's market. And then the other thing that I did was that here, I actually put this seller's market and buyer's market thing. They're just additional rows in my table, and I made the background color red and blue. They're not dynamic background colors. They're just static, so I didn't do anything special here. But what I did do was if I right-click on this row, there's this cool thing called row visibility. So I can set the row itself to be shown or hidden depending on a condition. So it's not the formatting that's conditional, it's the visibility that's conditional. And I just set this to be depending on whether the homes sell in less than 21 days, I made this visible. If it sells in more than 60 days, I made this visible. And then I put a footer at the bottom where I said it's run by, the report was run at this time. And these are just placeholders showing the page number in the report and the total number of pages in the report. The last thing that I did that's really important is if you run this, you'll often find that when you spit out your PDF, you get things not fitting on the page. Here's the way I ensure that it fits on the page. My page is going to be an 8.5 by 11 page. So if I just click in the background here, you'll see, here's my page size. Right there, 8.5 by 11. The margins default to 1 inch. And if you think 1 inch on each side, that's already eating up 2 inches of your page. So the thing that I do almost every time is cut that down to 1/4 of an inch. So 1/4 of an inch on all sides. So that's 1/2 inch taken off my 8.5 inches. That means I have 8 inches of screen or page width to work with. So then I go to my body for the report, and guess what I set that to? Exactly 8 inches. So that way, that plus the 2 margins on either side ensures that it will fit on the page. This can be a little bit tricky if you have a matrix with dynamic columns, because then it can sort of spill off the page depending on how much data you have. You just have to kind of anticipate that. But if you don't have any dynamic columns, then this will be exactly the width that you want. And so I'm going to run this. And you can see my nice page header, my table. And then for each city, or even at the national level, I have this repeating structure. And there's my conditionally formatted gauge. I've got some high-level metrics. And then I've got this line chart. This thing at the end that I did here, I made the data point conditionally visible and the data label conditionally visible using the same sort of expressions to just show where the chart ends up. So you can see, you could just go wild with this and do whatever you want. You get the basic principles of conditional visibility, conditional formatting. And when I spit this out to a PDF, because I was careful with those margins and everything, I'll show you an example of what you get. Unfortunately, this is, again, the screen resolution. But it fits exactly on the PDF page. I show my nice summary of all the cities and sort of a high-level scorecard type thing on page 1. And then on each subsequent page, I size it so that I get 2 of these on each page, so 2 cities per page. They don't break in the middle of the page or anything like that. So this is each city. And then, for example, Boston triggered that condition of it's a seller's market because it sells in less than 21 days. If I go to the next page, Chicago is a buyer's market, and so that thing showed up. So a pretty nice looking report. All right, so with that, let me switch back and just wrap up. So showed you all about how the Tablix control works, how you can use these graphics and colors and conditional formatting and conditional visibility to really spice it up and make things leap off the page, and a couple of things to keep in mind for designing things that print out really nicely to PDF or to a physical page. My call to action to you would be to go and download the latest version of Report Builder where you can try all this. Or if you prefer something integrated into Visual Studio, you'd use SQL Server Data Tools. The documentation to learn more about how to do all of this sort of stuff is available online. And if you just want to keep up with news, I encourage you to read the Reporting Services team blog, where I often blog about this sort of stuff. And with that, I want to ask you to evaluate the session, and then thank you very much for coming, and I hope you found it helpful.